The cruelest sound in a chapel is not a scream. It is the whisper that begins when the groom does not arrive. Eleanor Whitaker stood before the altar of Ashbourne Chapel with both hands wrapped around a bouquet of white roses, holding them so tightly that the silk ribbon pressed lines into her gloves. The chapel had been filled since noon, every pew crowded with relatives, neighbors, tenants, and the sort of society guests who could smell scandal before it fully opened its eyes. Sunlight came through the stained glass windows in long, colored beams, laying blue, red, and gold across the stone aisle, as if heaven itself had dressed the floor for a wedding. Yet beside Eleanor there was only empty air. Lord Julian Caldwell should have been standing there in his dark mourning coat, handsome, smiling, careless as always with the damage he caused. Instead, the space at her right remained vacant, more visible than any person in the room. The church bells had stopped 15 minutes ago. Father Alden had looked at the clock once, then twice, then a third time with the helpless discomfort of a man whose prayers could not cover a public embarrassment. Eleanor kept her chin level. Her veil softened the faces before her, turning the crowd into a blur of pale cheeks, dark hats, jeweled pins, and moving mouths. She could still hear them. That was the mercy no veil could give. Perhaps he changed his mind. Poor Miss Whitaker. The estate was always the real dowry. A Caldwell should never have been bound to desperation. The words slipped between the organ pipes and candle flames, small and polished and poisonous. Eleanor did not turn. If she turned, they would see the color leaving her face. If she lowered her head, they would mistake dignity for defeat. She thought of Whitaker Estate, 12 miles south beyond the winter fields, where the roof over the west wing still leaked when storms came from the coast, where her little brother Samuel slept in the nursery that had once been hers, where tenant families depended on rents being reduced rather than raised. She had not agreed to marry Julian because she believed his charming speeches. She had agreed because her father's death had left debts, land disputes, and a boy too young to inherit a crumbling legacy alone. A marriage to the Caldwell family would have bought time. Time was the one luxury grief had not left her. At the front pew, Duchess Caldwell sat rigid, her gloved hands folded over one another as if manners could strangle reality into obedience. Beside her, Duke Adrian Caldwell sat perfectly still. Eleanor had avoided looking at him all morning. It was difficult enough to stand in a chapel waiting for the wrong brother. It was unbearable to know the right one could see every fracture in her composure. Adrian wore black with the severity of a man who had never needed ornament to command a room. His gray eyes were fixed not on Eleanor, but on the chapel doors, as if he had already judged the absence beyond them and found it guilty. Unlike the others, he did not whisper. He did not pity her. He did not look away. That steadiness unsettled her more than mockery. The bouquet trembled once in her hands, and Eleanor tightened her grip until it stilled. Somewhere behind her, a woman gave a soft laugh and quickly covered it with a cough. The sound passed through the chapel like a pin drawn across glass. Eleanor felt heat rise beneath her veil, not from shame alone, but from the terrible injustice of being made into entertainment by people who had never paid the cost of survival. She wanted to walk out. She wanted to tear the veil from her face and leave every Caldwell name behind her like ashes on the altar steps. But Samuel's face came to her then, serious and trusting, asking whether she would still come home after the wedding. She had promised him she would. She had promised the tenants their leases would not be sold. She had promised her father at his bedside that Whitaker would not fall while she had breath to stand. So she stood. Father Alden cleared his throat, and the chapel stirred. The doors remained closed. The empty place beside her grew larger. Then, at the back of the aisle, the latch lifted. Every whisper stopped at once. Eleanor did not breathe. The doors opened, but Julian did not enter. A young messenger stepped inside, pale from the cold, holding a sealed letter in one shaking hand. He looked first at the priest, then at the Caldwell family, and finally at the bride standing alone before the altar. In that instant, before a single word was read aloud, Eleanor understood that abandonment had arrived wearing a messenger's coat. The chapel had gathered to witness her marriage. Instead, it was about to watch the world decide whether her humiliation would become her name. The messenger's boots sounded too loud against the stone aisle. Each step carried him farther into the chapel and carried Eleanor Whitaker farther from the life she had been promised, though promised was perhaps too generous a word for any arrangement built from debt, duty, and a man like Julian Caldwell. The young messenger stopped before Father Alden and bowed with the helpless misery of someone made responsible for another man's cowardice. The letter shook slightly in his hand. Its seal was unmistakable. Caldwell gray wax pressed with Julian's personal crest, a silver hawk that had always seemed romantic when stamped on invitations and unbearably cruel now. Father Alden took the letter, broke the seal, and read only 3 lines before the blood left his face. Behind Eleanor, the chapel breathed in as one body. No one had yet heard the words, but scandal has its own weather. It changes the air before the storm is named. Duchess Caldwell rose halfway from the front pew. "Father," she asked, her voice low and sharp. Duke Adrian Caldwell did not move. His eyes remained on the priest, but Eleanor felt, without looking, that his stillness had become dangerous. Father Alden swallowed. "Lord Julian Caldwell sends his regret," he began. A murmur passed through the chapel. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the bouquet until one rose stem bent beneath the ribbon. "He states that the marriage cannot proceed." The words struck with perfect gentleness, which made them worse. A direct blow might have allowed her to step back. This was softer, more public, designed to leave her standing while shame arranged itself around her like a second veil. Father Alden faltered, but the letter demanded completion. "He has departed Ashbourne for the coast, and asks forgiveness for any distress caused." Distress. The chapel erupted in whispers. Not loud enough to be called rude, never that. These people were trained in the elegant cruelty of half-voices. Distress was a spilled cup. Distress was a late carriage. Distress was not a bride abandoned before 200 witnesses, with her family's future balanced on the ceremony that had just collapsed. Near the rear pews, someone murmured Lady Marissa Vale's name. Then another voice added that her carriage had been seen leaving before dawn. A folded handkerchief was passed forward by a maid from the Caldwell household, white linen embroidered with a blue letter M, supposedly found in Julian's traveling carriage. Eleanor saw it in the priest's hand and understood the final flourish. Julian had not merely failed to appear. He had ensured there would be a story beautiful enough for gossip to repeat. Lady Marissa was not present to defend or deny it, which made her absence another kind of performance. The crowd shifted from pity to appetite. Eleanor could feel it. Their embarrassment had become entertainment. She heard one woman whisper that perhaps Julian had discovered something unfortunate. Another said the Whittaker family had always been too desperate. A third wondered whether Eleanor had mistaken obligation for affection. Each sentence landed lightly, but there were so many of them. Duchess Caldwell turned toward Eleanor with a face arranged in sorrow and social damage control. "My dear," she said, loud enough for the nearest pews to hear, "you must be overwhelmed. Perhaps it is best if you retire quietly." Quietly. That was what they wanted. A bride could be humiliated in public, but she was expected to disappear in silence so the room could preserve its manners. Eleanor looked down at the bouquet. The white roses had begun to tremble again. For one moment, she imagined dropping them, letting them scatter across the aisle like surrender. Then she thought of Samuel at Whittaker Estate, standing on the nursery stairs in his too large coat, trying to be brave because she had been brave first. She thought of tenant children with patched sleeves, of fields mortgaged too many times, of her father's hand in hers as he asked her to keep the name from being sold for parts. Eleanor took one slow breath. Then she lifted her free hand and drew back her veil. The motion was small, but it changed the chapel. Faces sharpened into view. Curious, pitying, amused, ashamed. Let them see her. Let them remember she had not hidden. Her cheeks were pale. Her eyes burned. But her spine remained straight. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said to Duchess Caldwell, her voice clear enough to travel. "I will not retire quietly from a shame I did not create." The murmurs faltered. At the front pew, Adrian's gaze moved to her at last. Something unreadable crossed his face, swift and deep as a shadow beneath water. It was not pity. Eleanor could have endured almost anything except pity. No, this was recognition. The chapel had expected tears. It had expected collapse. Instead, it saw a woman standing alone at the altar, stripped of protection but not of worth. And somewhere in that gathering silence, Duke Adrian Caldwell rose to his feet. When Duke Adrian Caldwell rose, the chapel did not fall silent all at once. It changed in layers. First, the whispers nearest the front pew stopped, then the ones along the center aisle faded, then even the restless rustle of silk and gloves seemed to remember itself and die away. Adrian did not hurry. He stepped from the pew with the calm of a man who had never needed speed to make a room feel his presence. His black coat was severe against the chapel's pale stone, his silver cuff links catching the stained glass light as he moved into the aisle. Eleanor Whitaker stood at the altar with her veil drawn back, the white roses in her hands no longer trembling, though Adrian had seen the effort it cost her. He had noticed more than anyone wished him to notice. That was his curse, his office, and perhaps the last decent thing his title had not taken from him. He had noticed Julian's absence before the bell stopped. He had noticed Duchess Caldwell calculating damage while pretending sorrow. He had noticed the guests leaning toward scandal as if warmth might be found in another person's disgrace. Most of all, he had noticed Eleanor refusing to collapse beneath the weight they were eager to place upon her. It brought him back, sharply and without permission, to 3 months earlier, when she had first entered Ashbourne House not as a bride flushed with romance, but as a woman carrying documents in a leather folder and worry in the set of her shoulders. Julian had introduced her with laughter, calling her practical, as though responsibility were an amusing habit. Eleanor had smiled politely, but her eyes had gone at once to the estate maps on the library table. Adrian remembered that. He remembered how she had asked whether tenant leases would remain protected after the marriage. Julian had waved the concern aside, promising everything would be handled. Adrian had looked up from his correspondence because the question was precise, and because no one in Julian's circle usually spoke of tenants unless rents were late. Later, when Julian abandoned that conversation for a drive with friends, Eleanor had remained near the maps, studying the borders of Whitaker land as if each line enclosed a human life. Adrian had asked whether she understood the Caldwell settlement terms. She had answered that she understood enough to be afraid. That was the first honest sentence he had ever heard from her. From then on, honesty had followed them in quiet, forbidden intervals. A winter walk through the Ashbourne Gardens while Julian entertained guests indoors. A discussion over coal deliveries after Eleanor confessed that Whitaker tenants were cutting fallen branches to survive the cold. A letter Adrian sent anonymously through his steward, arranging fuel to reach 3 tenant cottages before the worst storm. Eleanor had discovered the source within a week. She had said nothing publicly. She had only met Adrian in the corridor and whispered, "Kindness is harder to repay when it hides its name." He had replied, "Then do not repay it. Use it." Those moments should have remained harmless. A future brother-in-law assisting a woman bound to his family by contract. Nothing improper. Nothing spoken that could not survive daylight. Yet Adrian had begun to understand that Julian wanted Eleanor's name, her land, the appearance of virtue beside her quiet strength. He did not want her burdens. He did not want the tenants she worried over, the young brother she protected, or the pride that made her stand straighter when frightened. Adrian reached the altar now with that knowledge burning cold beneath his ribs. Father Alden held Julian's letter as though it had become unclean. Duchess Caldwell stood rigid in the front pew, her face warning him to preserve the family's dignity. But dignity had already been lost. Not by the abandoned bride, by the man who had left her there. Adrian stopped beside Eleanor, not touching her, not claiming her grief, only placing himself where the room could no longer look at her without seeing him too. "Father Alden," he said, his voice carrying through the chapel with controlled clarity, "before this gathering mistakes cowardice for tragedy, I would like my brother's letter read in full." The priest blinked. "Your Grace, I do not know if that is wise." Neither was leaving a woman at the altar and expecting silence to finish the insult. A faint gasp moved through the pews. Eleanor turned her face slightly toward him. He did not look back yet, because if he did, he feared the chapel might see too much. Instead, he faced the crowd, the Caldwell family, the polished witnesses who had come expecting vows and stayed for humiliation. "My brother has not abandoned a bride," Adrian said. "He has exposed himself as unworthy of one." The words landed with the finality of a door closing. Every whisper died. Even the candles seemed to still. Eleanor drew one breath, quiet but deep, and Adrian finally looked at her. She was pale, wounded, and standing. In that moment, He understood that the chapel had gathered to watch her lose everything. Instead, it was about to learn what kind of man would step forward when honor demanded more than blood loyalty. Adrian Caldwell's words held the chapel like a hand over a flame. No one moved quickly. No one dared. The guests who had leaned forward for scandal now leaned back from consequence, their faces arranged into the solemn caution of people realizing that the story might not belong to them after all. Eleanor Whitaker stood beside him with the bouquet still in her hands, feeling the weight of 200 eyes shift away from her exposed humiliation and toward the man who had named it correctly. It did not erase the wound. Nothing could. Julian's empty place remained beside the altar. The letter still rested in Father Alden's hand. The white roses were still bruised beneath her grip. But the shape of the room had changed. A moment earlier, she had been the abandoned bride. Now she was the woman a duke had publicly refused to let society bury. Duchess Caldwell rose fully from the front pew, her expression pale with contained fury. "Adrian," she said, each syllable polished thin, "this is neither the time nor place for family judgment." "On the contrary," he replied without looking away from the chapel, "my brother chose both." A quiet breath passed through the pews. Eleanor saw several faces lower, not from pity now, but from embarrassment at having been caught enjoying what should have shamed them. Adrian turned to Father Alden. "Read the letter in full." The priest hesitated, then glanced at the guests, at the Duchess, at Eleanor, and finally at Adrian. Whatever he saw in the Duke's face made refusal impossible. He unfolded the paper again. "Lord Julian writes that he cannot in good conscience proceed with the marriage, as his heart is otherwise engaged." A ripple moved through the chapel, softer this time, uncertain where to land. Father Alden continued, his voice tightening. "He asks that Miss Whitaker accept his regrets and hopes that the financial arrangements between the families may still be honored in a manner suitable to all parties." Eleanor's blood went cold. Financial arrangements. Not sorrow. Not remorse. Not even shame disguised as apology. Julian had left her at the altar and still expected to harvest what the marriage was meant to give him. Adrian's jaw hardened. "There it is," he said. Duchess Caldwell's fan snapped shut. "Enough." "Not nearly." Adrian faced the chapel fully now, and the stained glass light cut across his black coat in bars of color, making him appear less like a brother defending a family and more like judgment standing in human form. For 3 months, Miss Whitaker was told that this marriage would protect her estate, her younger brother, and the families who depend upon her land. Yet last night, I discovered a secondary agreement prepared under Julian's instruction. It would have transferred a portion of Caldwell debt into the Whitaker accounts immediately after the ceremony, while granting Julian administrative control over Whitaker holdings. Eleanor felt the chapel tilt beneath her. The bouquet lowered slightly in her hands. She had known there were risks. She had feared losing herself to duty. But this was worse. She had been walking toward a trap dressed as rescue. Father Alden looked stricken. Several men in the back pews began to whisper again, but the sound died when Adrian's gaze reached them. "My brother's absence did not ruin Miss Whitaker," Adrian said. "It spared her from a contract no honorable man would have allowed." The words passed through Eleanor slowly. Spared. The humiliation remained, but beneath it something else stirred, painful and bright. Julian had not destroyed her future this morning. He had revealed the danger before the vows could seal it. Lady Caldwell pressed one hand to her chest. "You would expose your own brother before the entire county?" Adrian's voice did not rise. He exposed himself when he used a chapel as cover for a ledger. Eleanor turned toward him then. "You knew last night?" He looked at her, and for the first time since he had stepped forward, grief crossed his face unguarded. "I found the agreement after you left the library. I intended to stop the signing before the ceremony began." Julian ran before I could confront him. The library, the contract, the brush of their hands over paper. The way Adrian had looked at her when he said she was the only one trying to save the people beneath her name. Every quiet moment returned with new meaning. He had not been interfering. He had been guarding a door she had not known was open beneath her feet. Eleanor drew a breath that trembled only at the end. "And now?" she asked. Adrian turned slightly so the chapel could hear his answer, but his eyes remained on her. "Now you choose. You may leave this chapel under your own name, with my protection against any Caldwell claim upon Whitaker estate. Or, if you wish the ceremony to continue for the sake of your brother, your tenants, and your standing before those who came to watch you fall, I will stand where my brother was too unworthy to stand." The chapel became utterly silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a room forced to witness dignity return to the person it had tried to strip bare. Eleanor looked down at the ring waiting on the silver tray. No longer Julian's promise. No longer a symbol of humiliation, but a question. Some altars expose betrayal. Others wait, cold and patient, until truth gives the bride back her voice. Eleanor Whitaker did not answer at once, because choice, when returned after humiliation, can feel almost as frightening as loss. The chapel waited around her, breath held beneath vaulted stone and colored glass. Every witness suddenly forced to recognize that she was no longer standing where Julian Caldwell had left her. She was standing at the edge of a new decision, one that belonged to her. The ring on the silver tray caught the stained glass light. A small circle of gold that had moments earlier seemed to mock her with its uselessness. Now it looked different. Not gentle. Not romantic. Not safe in the way young girls imagine safety before life teaches them the price of promises. It looked like a door, and beyond that door stood Whitaker estate, her brother Samuel, the tenant farms, the unpaid accounts, and every person who would suffer if pride made her refuse the one honest hand extended in a room full of hidden knives. She heard Duchess Caldwell whisper Adrian's name again, this time not as a warning, but as a plea for control already slipping away. He did not turn. That mattered to Eleanor. He had made his offer before the chapel, before his mother, before the guests, before all the people who would carry the tale into every parlor by nightfall, but he did not press it upon her. He stood near enough to shield, far enough to let her breathe. 3 months of quiet memories moved through her like pages stirred by wind. Julian laughing over dinner while forgetting the name of Samuel's tutor. Julian praising her beauty when she spoke of drainage repairs, as though flattery could replace attention. Julian promising that everything would be arranged, always arranged, never explained. Then Adrian in the library, silent over the settlement papers, his brow darkening as he read the clauses Julian had called tedious. Adrian asking whether Whitaker tenants kept winter stores. Adrian sending coal without wanting credit. Adrian walking beside her in the frost garden and listening when she said that an estate was not land, but people who trusted a name to mean shelter. She had feared his silence because it held no easy charm. Now she understood it had held respect. Eleanor looked at Father Alden. "If I choose to leave under my own name," she said, her voice steady enough to surprise even herself, "will the Caldwell family withdraw all claim against Whitaker estate?" Duchess Caldwell rose sharply. "Miss Whitaker, this is hardly the place for legal negotiation." Adrian's answer came before the Duchess could reclaim the room. "Yes, I will see to it." Eleanor turned to him. "And if I choose to continue?" The chapel grew impossibly still. Adrian's eyes met hers without flinching. "Then I will enter this marriage with a public settlement protecting Whitaker estate from Caldwell debt, guaranteeing Samuel's guardianship remains in your chosen trust, and placing all tenant leases beyond revision for 10 years. A murmur spread, but softer now, astonished rather than cruel. Eleanor felt the breath leave her. Those were not romantic vows. They were better. They were the exact boundaries she had been trying to secure alone, spoken aloud by the one man in the room with enough power to make society listen. "And what do you ask in return?" she said. The question carried every caution she owned. Adrian understood. She saw it in the way his face grew more solemn, not offended, not wounded, only careful. "Truth," he said. "Honesty between us. Nothing performed for the comfort of this room. Nothing taken that is not freely given. If, after this day, you wish only protection and distance, you shall have both." The words moved through the chapel in a silence deeper than scandal. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the bouquet. A white petal had fallen onto the stone near her shoe. For one fragile moment, she mourned the girl who had entered the chapel hoping duty might be enough. Then she let that girl go. She placed the bouquet on the altar rail, slowly, deliberately, as if setting down the last weight Julian had given her. When she faced the room again, the veil was behind her shoulders, her hands were empty, and her voice belonged fully to herself. I will not marry to preserve Caldwell dignity, she said. I will not marry because I was abandoned. I will marry only if this union protects Whitaker, Samuel, and every person my father left in my care. Adrian inclined his head. Then those are the terms. Father Alden looked between them, stunned by the transformation of a ceremony into covenant. The silver tray trembled slightly in the young attendant's hands as he stepped forward. Eleanor reached for the ring. Adrian did not take it from the tray first. He waited, letting her choose the object before he ever touched her hand. That restraint, small as a candle flame, lit something in her chest that grief had failed to extinguish. She lifted the ring and held it toward him. Then stand with me, Your Grace, she said, not over me. Adrian accepted the ring, and for the first time that day, the chapel's silence did not feel like judgment. It felt like witness. Some women are saved by being carried away from the altar. Eleanor Whitaker was saved because, before everyone who expected her to vanish, she chose the terms on which she would remain. Adrian Caldwell took the ring from Eleanor Whitaker with the care of a man accepting not a jewel, but the weight of a life placed briefly within his keeping. The chapel watched every movement. No one coughed. No silk rustled. Even the late winter light through the stained glass seemed to hold itself still upon the stone floor. Eleanor extended her left hand, bare now that she had removed the glove meant for another man, and Adrian paused before touching her. That pause mattered. In a room where her choices had nearly been arranged, traded, and humiliated beyond repair, he let the silence ask her once more whether she still chose this. Eleanor answered by lifting her hand a little higher. Only then did he take it. His fingers were warm, steady, and careful, touching her as one might touch a document of great value and greater consequence. The ring slid into place, not with the bright promise of a girlish dream, but with the solemn finality of a boundary drawn before witnesses. Eleanor looked down at the gold band resting against her skin and felt no rush of romance. She felt the strange, bracing strength of being seen. Father Alden, still visibly shaken by the turn of the ceremony, cleared his throat and asked in a voice more humble than official whether they wished to proceed under the revised intention. Adrian looked to Eleanor, not to his mother, not to the guests, not to the old Caldwell pride seated in the front pew with a face like carved ice. Miss Whitaker, he said. Not my lady, not my bride, as if possession could be assumed. Miss Whitaker, as if her name still belonged to her. She drew a breath and nodded. Proceed. The word passed through the chapel like the striking of a bell. Duchess Caldwell sat down slowly, defeated not by force, but by the public impossibility of contradicting honor once it had been spoken clearly. Father Alden began again, his voice steadier with each phrase. The old vows had been prepared for Julian, but they changed as they were spoken now, because the man standing beside Eleanor did not smile falsely, did not reach for charm, did not pretend this sudden union had been born from roses and music. When asked whether he would protect, respect, and honor the woman before him, Adrian answered, I will, with such controlled certainty that several heads lowered in the pews. When Eleanor's turn came, she did not look at the empty place Julian had left. She looked at Adrian. I will, she said, not as surrender, but as signature. Outside, beyond the chapel walls, the winter wind moved over Ashbourne grounds, carrying away whatever story the guests had expected to tell. Inside, the story had become less convenient. A bride had not collapsed. A duke had not preserved his brother's lie. A marriage had not repaired scandal. It had exposed the shape of it. After the final blessing, no one applauded. It was not that kind of ending. The silence remained, deep and complete, but its meaning had changed. Earlier, it had been the silence that gathers around shame. Now it was the silence that follows a verdict. Adrian offered Eleanor his arm. She rested her hand upon his sleeve, light but steady, and together they turned to face the chapel. The guests stood because rank required it, but many rose slowly because conscience had become heavier than etiquette. Eleanor saw the same women who had whispered lower their eyes. She saw men who had laughed behind gloves now study the floor. She saw Duchess Caldwell's rigid profile and Father Alden's troubled relief. Then, at the back of the chapel, she saw Samuel. Her younger brother had arrived late with their old housekeeper, breathless from the road, his dark coat dusted with snow, his face pale with fear that changed to astonishment when he saw the ring on her hand and Adrian standing beside her. Eleanor's composure nearly broke then, not from humiliation, but from the sudden mercy of having something to bring home besides ruin. Adrian followed her gaze and inclined his head slightly toward the boy, a silent acknowledgement of the promise he had made before the altar. That gesture did more to steady Eleanor than any speech could have. The chapel doors opened, and cold air swept in, bright with winter. Eleanor stepped forward on Adrian's arm, past the pews, past the whispers that no longer dared rise, past the place where the messenger had delivered abandonment wrapped in wax and paper. At the threshold, she paused just long enough to look back at the altar. She had entered that aisle as a woman prepared to sacrifice happiness for duty. She left it with duty still before her, happiness uncertain, and a man beside her who understood that honor was not a word spoken over women, but a shelter built around their right to stand. Some vows begin as love, others begin as justice, and only later teach the heart how to believe. The first breath outside Ashbourne Chapel tasted of snow, candle smoke, and consequence. Eleanor Whitaker stood on the stone steps with Adrian Caldwell beside her. The chapel doors opened behind them, and the winter grounds stretching pale beneath a sky the color of silver ash. Guests gathered in uneasy clusters along the path, speaking in the lowered tones of people who had witnessed something too dramatic to condemn and too honorable to dismiss. Some stared at the ring on Eleanor's hand. Some stared at Adrian, as if trying to reconcile the feared Duke of Ashbourne with the man who had just chosen a bride his brother had abandoned. Eleanor felt each glance settle on her shoulders, but they did not crush her as they had inside the chapel. The weight was different now. It was still judgment, but no longer unopposed. Samuel broke from the edge of the crowd and hurried toward her, stopping only when he remembered the formality of so many eyes. He was 14, pale from worry, his dark coat too thin for the cold, his face caught between confusion and relief. "Eleanor," he said, and the single word nearly undid her. She released Adrian's arm only long enough to take her brother's hands. "I am well." Samuel looked at the ring, then at Adrian, then back to her. "Are you safe?" The question carried more wisdom than his years should have allowed. Eleanor answered before anyone else could. "Safer than I was this morning." Adrian stepped forward then, not crowding the moment, but giving Samuel the courtesy of being addressed as the young gentleman he was trying very hard to become. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "your sister secured terms today that protect your estate and your future. I intend to honor them." Samuel straightened at once under the dignity of being spoken to plainly. "Then I intend to hold you to them, Your Grace." A faint stir moved through the nearby guests. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes warmed by the smallest degree. "Good." Eleanor felt the fragile edge of a smile and had to look away before it betrayed her. The carriage that should have carried Julian and his bride away from the chapel now stood empty beneath the bare elms, its white ribbons shivering in the wind like remnants of a story already discarded. Duchess Caldwell descended the steps with measured control, her face composed for public survival. "Adrian," she said, "this matter must be handled with discretion." Adrian looked toward the assembled guests, then back to his mother. Discretion was offered to Julian before he chose spectacle. "He is still your brother, and Eleanor is now my wife." The words were spoken evenly, but they changed the air again. Eleanor felt them move through the crowd, through Samuel's grip on her hand, through her own uncertain heart. Wife. The word was too new, too large, too full of rooms she had not entered. Yet Adrian did not say it as possession. He said it as responsibility, as shield, as fact no one would be allowed to soften into rumor. Duchess Caldwell's lips pressed together. "Society will ask questions. Then I suggest society begin with the contract Julian attempted to conceal." She went still. Around them, the nearest guests pretended not to listen and failed completely. Adrian turned to Eleanor, lowering his voice so only she and Samuel could hear. "We should leave before the story grows more mouths." Eleanor nodded, but before she moved, she looked once more toward the chapel. Father Alden stood in the doorway, holding Julian's letter and the discarded handkerchief embroidered with the blue letter M. Two small objects, and yet together they had nearly rewritten her life. Adrian followed her gaze. I will have copies made of every document before nightfall. And Whitaker Estate? She asked. Protected by the settlement, I spoke aloud. My solicitor will draft the formal language today. You had no time to prepare for this, she said softly. I had 3 months to notice what my brother ignored. The answer struck her more deeply than tenderness would have. She looked at him then, truly looked, at the man whose silence she had feared, whose restraint had just saved her from being turned into a cautionary tale. He did not ask for gratitude. He did not look triumphant. He looked solemn, as if justice had cost him something private. Samuel climbed into the carriage first, still watching Adrian with cautious respect. Eleanor followed, gathering her ivory skirts away from the snow. Adrian offered his hand. She accepted it because refusing would have been performance, and after that morning, she had no patience left for performance. His hand closed around hers briefly, steady and warm. Once seated, she looked out as the chapel steps receded. The guests blurred into dark shapes against the snow. The empty place at the altar was behind her now, but the life ahead remained unwritten, frightening, and bound to a man she barely knew but had begun, dangerously, to trust. As the carriage turned toward Whitaker Estate, Eleanor rested her ringed hand in her lap. She had not been rescued from duty. She had been given the chance to fulfill it without standing alone. Whitaker Estate received them beneath a sky thick with late afternoon snow, its pale stone walls rising beyond the frozen drive like a house holding its breath. Eleanor Caldwell, though the name still felt unfamiliar in the secret chambers of her mind, sat beside Samuel while Adrian Caldwell rode opposite them, silent and watchful, one gloved hand resting near the leather case that held the settlement drafts, Julian's letter, and the copy of the concealed agreement. The journey had not been long in miles, but it had stretched strangely, as if the road between chapel and home belonged to two separate lives. Samuel had fallen quiet after the first questions, studying Adrian with the cautious intelligence of a boy who had learned that adults could change the future without asking whether children were ready for it. Adrian answered each question plainly. No false comfort. No charming evasions. By the time the carriage stopped, Samuel no longer looked reassured, exactly, but he looked less alone. That was more than Eleanor had been able to give him that morning. The old housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, opened the front door before the footman could knock, her apron still dusted with flour, her eyes red from worry. She saw Eleanor's ivory gown first, then the ring, then the Duke stepping down behind her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she pressed one hand to her mouth and whispered, "Miss Eleanor." Eleanor crossed the steps and took her hands. "Not lost," she said softly, because that was the simplest truth and the one Mrs. Bell needed most. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of beeswax, cold stone, and the rosemary bread Mrs. Bell baked whenever fear made waiting unbearable. The familiar walls nearly undid Eleanor more than the chapel had. Here were the portraits of Whitakers who had survived wars, debt, storms, and foolish pride. Here was the staircase Samuel had slid down as a child. Here was the cracked blue vase her mother had refused to replace because beauty, she said, was allowed to have a history. Adrian entered last, removing his hat with quiet respect. He did not look around like a conqueror inspecting property. He looked like a man entering another family's grief by invitation and understanding the sacredness of restraint. Mrs. Bell noticed it too, her shoulders lowered by a fraction. "We will need the library," Adrian said, "and any current estate accounts, tenant leases, and correspondence from Caldwell solicitors." Eleanor looked at him. Tonight. Julian's absence will move faster than our carriage did." Samuel frowned. "What does that mean?" Eleanor answered him, because Adrian waited for her to do so. "It means Lord Julian may try to make the story favor him before the truth has time to speak." They gathered in the library as snow thickened against the windows. Lamps were lit. The fire was built high. Mrs. Bell brought tea no one drank and bread no one touched. Adrian spread the documents across her father's desk, arranging scandal into neat columns. The original marriage settlement, the hidden debt transfer, Julian's letter, and the new terms Adrian had spoken in the chapel. Eleanor stood beside him, reading each line with a clarity that made shame turn slowly into anger. Julian had meant to leave her with Whitaker obligations, Caldwell debts, and public blame if she resisted. The altar had not been his failure. It had been the stage for his escape. Adrian pointed to one clause near the bottom of the concealed agreement. If the ceremony had proceeded, this would have allowed Julian to argue administrative control within 30 days. Samuel leaned over the desk, face pale. Of our land. Of your sister's authority, Adrian said. The land would have followed. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She did not faint. She did not weep. She simply let the truth settle where illusion had been. When she opened them, Adrian was watching her, not with pity, but with the same quiet recognition he had shown at the altar. You knew enough to be afraid, he said. Now you know enough to fight. Before she could answer, a horse sounded in the drive. Mrs. Bell looked toward the window. Samuel stiffened. Adrian moved first, not toward Eleanor, but toward the papers, gathering the most dangerous ones back into the leather case. A knock struck the front door. Not frantic. Formal. The kind of knock used by someone who expected to be admitted because the world had always opened for him. Mrs. Bell returned moments later, her face tight. A messenger from Lord Julian, my lady. Eleanor felt the old name, my lady, fall differently now. Adrian did not speak. He waited. The choice, she understood, was hers. Show him in, she said. The messenger entered carrying a sealed envelope and an expression rehearsed for sympathy. He bowed toward Eleanor, then faltered when he saw Adrian standing beside the desk. From Lord Julian Caldwell, he said. He requests that private misunderstandings not be allowed to damage the families further. Eleanor took the letter but did not open it. She laid it on the desk beside the document Julian had tried to hide. Tell Lord Julian, she said, her voice calm enough to frighten herself. That misunderstanding ended at the altar. The messenger swallowed. Adrian's eyes remained on Eleanor, and in them she saw the smallest ember of approval. Not ownership, not triumph. Witness. Outside, the snow fell steadily over Whitaker Estate, covering carriage tracks, garden paths, and old mistakes. Inside, the bride who had been left standing before a chapel full of whispers had found her voice in her father's library, and this time, no one spoke over it. Julian Caldwell came to Whitaker Estate after dusk, not as a groom returning with remorse, but as a man surprised to find the stage occupied after he had abandoned the performance. His carriage lamps appeared first through the falling snow, two blurred yellow eyes moving up the drive. Then the wheels stopped before the front steps with a confidence Eleanor Caldwell recognized at once. He expected entrance. He expected explanation. Most of all, he expected his brother's sudden marriage to be treated as an emotional accident that could be managed, softened, and perhaps made useful. In the library, the fire burned high against the winter dark. Samuel stood near the mantel. Mrs. Bell waited by the door with folded hands, and Adrian Caldwell remained beside the desk where the documents lay in ordered stacks. Eleanor stood at the center of the room, still wearing her ivory wedding gown beneath a dark shawl Mrs. Bell had placed around her shoulders. The ring on her hand caught the firelight each time she breathed. When Julian entered, handsome and pale from the cold, his expression was arranged in wounded dignity. Lady Marissa Vale was nowhere beside him, which seemed fitting. Cowardice often preferred to arrive alone when consequences were waiting. Eleanor, he said softly, as though using her first name could return him to a privilege he had forfeited. I came to prevent further damage. Samuel made a sharp movement, but Adrian lifted one hand slightly, not commandingly, only enough to still the room. Eleanor looked at Julian and felt, to her quiet astonishment, no longing, no humiliation, not even the old anxious hope that he might become better if someone loved him responsibly enough. She felt clarity. The damage has already been named, she said. Julian's eyes flicked to the papers on the desk, then to Adrian. My brother has always enjoyed severity. He sees schemes where there are merely complications. Adrian's voice was calm. The hidden debt transfer was not a complication. A financial adjustment, Julian replied quickly. One my advisors believed would strengthen both houses after the ceremony. Eleanor picked up the concealed agreement and held it without unfolding it. By placing Caldwell debt inside Whitaker accounts and giving you administrative control over my estate within 30 days. Julian's pleasant expression tightened. You do not understand the language of such matters. No, she said. I understand it now. The room grew still. Outside, snow tapped against the windows like quiet fingers. Julian turned from her, as if a woman's understanding were an inconvenience rather than a fact, and addressed Adrian. You cannot mean to keep this marriage. It was a spectacle born of outrage. Society will laugh once the shock fades. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. Society laughed this morning when you left her alone before an altar. I found its judgment unimpressive. Color rose in Julian's face. You married her to punish me. No, Adrian said. I married her because you tried to use her. Eleanor heard the difference. So did Julian. His eyes shifted back to her, and for the first time, the charm failed to find a place to settle. Eleanor, you are angry. Understandably. But you have tied yourself to a man who does not love you. The words should have wounded. Instead, they revealed how little he had ever known about her. Love had not brought her to the altar that morning. Duty had. Trust had been absent. Respect had been scarce. Now, beside a man who had promised nothing falsely, she discovered that truth could be kinder than affection performed for applause. Perhaps, she said, but he did not lie to me. Julian stared at her. Adrian did not move, yet the silence around him deepened with something unsaid. Eleanor laid the agreement on the desk beside Julian's letter. Tomorrow, copies of these documents will go to the county clerk, to Adrian's solicitor, and to every party named in the settlement. Whitaker estate will remain under protected terms. Samuel's guardianship will not pass through Caldwell hands. The tenants' leases will stand. Julian's mouth parted slightly. You would ruin me. Eleanor looked at the man who had left her in a chapel and expected her shame to serve his convenience. No, I am allowing the truth to become public. If it ruins you, that is because you built yourself around the wrong secret. Julian's composure broke only in the smallest ways, a tightened jaw, a breath drawn too sharply, the hand closing around his hat. Then he bowed, because men like him often retreated behind manners when power failed. You will regret this, he said. Adrian stepped forward then, not enough to threaten, only enough to make the boundary visible. She has had enough regret delivered by Caldwell men for one day. Julian left without another word. When the front door closed, the house seemed to exhale. Samuel crossed to Eleanor and stood close, not touching her, simply present in the way family becomes shelter when words are too small. Mrs. Bell wiped her eyes discreetly. Adrian gathered the papers and placed them back into the leather case. You were very calm, he said. Eleanor looked down at the ring, then toward the dark window where Julian's carriage lamps faded into the snow. I was not calm. I was finished being afraid in a room where I had the truth. Adrian's expression softened by a degree so small only someone watching closely would have seen it. That is often what courage is. For the first time that day, Eleanor allowed herself to be tired. Not broken. Tired. There was a difference, and it felt like mercy. Adrian offered his arm, not as a claim, but as a question. She accepted. Together they turned toward the hall where Samuel waited to show them the old estate maps, where the future of Whitaker would have to be repaired line by line, tenant by tenant, winter by winter. Their marriage had begun before witnesses, but not as love. It had begun as a refusal. Refusal to let a woman's humiliation become entertainment. Refusal to let a family name be used as bait. Refusal to let silence protect the wrong man. Some chapels echo with vows. Others remember the moment a forsaken bride stood beside the right brother and taught every whisper in the room to fall silent.